The following program contains disturbing materials that may not be suitable for some resellers. Viewer discretion is advised.
I want to talk to you guys about something I've been thinking about that really I think we need to change the mentality, and that's the seller mentality when it comes to this one thing. And what am I talking about? And that is the idea of receiving a negative feedback. First of all, let's just kind of put this out there. If you get a negative feedback, it sucks. It feels bad, right? Maybe you feel like you did something bad, or maybe you could have done something differently to avoid the whole situation. I think we can all agree on that. But at the end of the day, it is not the end of the world. It is not going to kill your business. It is not going to shut down your sales. It simply is just really dependent on how you handle it. And we'll talk about that here in a minute. But it's not the end of the world. And I know that back in the day, back in the wild, wild west, we're talking going way back, it was the way to measure your performance on the platform. And we're talking many years ago where there weren't as many different KPIs or key performance indicators that eBay would use to determine how you were as a seller. And eBay even allowed sellers to leave negative feedback on buyers. I know we all wish that was a thing, but there's a reason why it's not, because it was abused by sellers. Seller would give bad service, and deservedly so would receive a negative feedback, and boom, the buyer would, the seller would retaliate and say all kinds of nasty things. And if you were around back then in selling as a seller, you would remember a lot of these things that these sellers were doing. It was quite appalling. So I get it. I understand why we can't leave, even if it's when it's appropriate, negative feedback on buyers. And many of you wish that we can, but again, human behavior is what it is, and they've already done that experiment. And I can tell you that there's going to be a bunch of bad apple sellers who will abuse it. So that's the reason why we can't. But going back to the whole idea as a seller of receiving a negative feedback, because there's other ways to measure your performance, how you handle your orders, how timely you get back to a customer, your sell-through rate as a store, your defects or lack thereof, your lates when it comes to shipments. There's a lot of different things that eBay can do to really measure your performance. Now, that's not to say that if you get a negative feedback that maybe there is a slight maybe ding on your account health for a very short period of time, like a day or two. I can tell you from just observation that it seems like whenever I get a negative feedback or I get a return or something that's detrimental, like an item not as described return, it feels like I maybe don't get the same kind of momentum or traffic or sales or a number of offers that I may have received without all that, right? But I think sometimes as sellers, we kind of attach our performance to things that happen. So if you get a negative feedback and sales are great, you probably don't even realize it or think about it. But if you get a negative feedback and sales kind of fall off, then you put two and two together and say, that's because I got the negative feedback. I think a lot of us sellers do that when we probably just shouldn't. When we should look at our performance as a whole, maybe over a week, over a month, and maybe for some larger businesses over a year, rather than get caught up in the moment. And I think that's what happens. The idea of receiving a negative feedback kind of paralyzes us to the point where we cede the power back to the buyer. And I think we can all agree that eBay has given enough power to the buyer and enough leeway to the buyer, more so than they give to the seller. And as sellers, we really need to knock it off. And what am I saying? What am I saying we need to knock off? We need to knock off the idea that we're going to cave in to a buyer when they even suggest or hint at a negative feedback or a bad review, or however the buyers want to phrase it. But you guys know what I'm talking about. Those buyers who reach out to you whether it's warranted or not, and get nasty. And, you know, I've always thought that as a person running an eBay store or a business, that we need to be as professional as possible. And the buyers, well, they're not. They don't have to be. And many of them are coming at you maybe with an attitude from the previous experience they've had on eBay that wasn't good, and they're taking it out on you, and you just can't take it personally. But many will come to you with the idea and the threat that they are going to leave a negative feedback. And sometimes, you know, a couple examples that I have, or one example that I have is one that happened recently, where they came at me saying that the item didn't work and they wanted either another one or they wanted me to give them a full refund. No pictures, no any, you know, nothing, no proof of anything that they're saying. And so I came back and I said, you know, we don't do that. Please return the item back to us. We'll be glad to provide you with a paid return label, and once we get it back, we'll give you a full refund. And the buyer came back and said, well, it's only a $14 item. It sounds to me like you're telling me that you don't believe me. And, you know, I just don't understand. It's not something I wouldn't lie about or something like that. Well, buyers do it all the time. And of course, I'm not going to come back and say, well, it's possible you are lying to me. But I came back with something saying, look, we require a return. We don't give partial refunds, mainly because I have to, if there's a problem with the item, I have to take it up with my supplier. Now, you know, that's, many of us get these items from yard sales, and I happen to get mine from a friend that I know doesn't hang on to things that are broken. He simply went from DeWalt to Milwaukee and had this battery just sitting around and hadn't used it in a while. So who knows? But I told him that this buyer never responded back. But the idea, when buyers come to you with the partial refund shakedown, and a lot of times they'll come back and say, well, I guess I'm going to have to leave a 1-star review. And I had that happen to me. And I stood my ground, because I knew that even if they did leave a negative feedback, the fact that they came at me asking me for a partial refund, well, that's not allowed on eBay. And while eBay has become more difficult to get negative feedback removed, well, I know that if I cite policy and at least try to get the negative removed, there's a good chance it can get removed and will get removed. And that's the thing, guys. I'm not saying that as sellers we need to be just rude to the customer and not work with the customer. If you've screwed up, if you've sent out a red shirt that should have been green, well, that's your mistake. You need to own it. Now, if the buyer's willing to keep it at a discounted rate, well, that's a resolution that you need to offer. If let's say you send a broken item out and it wasn't broken, but maybe it got broken en route, or maybe you forgot to include the accessories, and the buyer can point it out and show you with a little bit of proof. I think many legitimate buyers do provide photos to try to say, hey, here's what's going on. Well, you should take care of that buyer. Work with the buyer to come up with the best resolution that works for both parties. That's fair. So I'm not saying to not do partial refunds, but what I'm saying is there's many sellers out there who will immediately freak out and cave at the idea, or maybe the insinuation, that a buyer is going to leave a negative feedback if they don't get this resolved the way that they're wanting it resolved. And as sellers, what I'm saying is, don't cave in. You know what? My response is, hey, I'm here to help you in any way I can within my boundaries, and ultimately you're going to do what you're going to do, and provide as customer friendly, customer focused service as you can, and let the chips fall where they may. And if the buyer violates eBay policy, I would say almost in all cases dispute through the negative feedback removal tool to have that negative feedback removed. But don't worry about it if it happens. I have 2 in the last week, and my sales are great. I'm up 30% from last month in sales, and I'm up 15% year over year the same period of time. And I've received these 2 negatives within the last 2 weeks. Follow up with a very professional reply. Okay, maybe to describe briefly what you've done. Maybe you've reached out to the buyer, you've offered a return, and make it a very professional explanation so that a reasonable person, and people do look at these negative feedbacks, or they look at your feedback to see how you perform. I know I do. Now I know not everyone's like me, but there's a lot of people out there, not the majority, but enough, who will look at your feedback. And if you provide a professional explanation, not one that's snarky, not one that's attacking the buyer, but one that's just professional, I'm willing to believe that most people are reasonable and will see that and not only think that you are involved in your business to where you're going to reply to a feedback that's received, but you're a professional person and you're not going to stoop down to some of these replies that I've seen that sellers have left, and it just makes them at the end look even worse than the negative feedback makes them look. So don't panic over negative feedback, okay? Just know that if you sell enough items in this game, you're going to get things like negative feedback and returns. And these are the two things I think a lot of people allow to really get them in feeling in a certain way about reselling and about eBay. But if you're doing the game right, if you're playing the game right, you're making money, that's the goal, long term, and people are going to hate me for saying this, but it's the cost of doing business. And having a ding here, a ding there, these are things out of your control, especially those buyers who don't even bother to reach out to you to let you know anything. Like I had a 3 feedback buyer who sent me a message saying that this garage door opener doesn't work. How do I get my money back? That's what they said. And these things have to be programmed to match up with what you have on your garage door receiver. And I reached out to the buyer, said, hey, let me help you with that, because you do have to program these things, and if it still doesn't work, actually in this case, I'll offer to give you a refund. But they never replied back. And eBay, they're going to allow that to stand because they allow the buyers to leave whatever feedback they think is appropriate, and eBay will side with the buyer almost every time unless you can prove that the buyer somehow violated eBay policy, like feedback extortion, meaning that they're wanting money or they're going to leave a negative feedback, or calling you a name, or being nasty. But you know what? It's still worth fighting every time, because nobody else is going to fight for your account but you. But beyond that, beyond requesting to have that removed and dealing with the buyer to see if they're willing to remove it, don't spend any more time and move on. Let it just fall off naturally, and try to improve on the next situation. Maybe it was warranted, but what I'm finding is many feedbacks could have been prevented. Unfortunately, the other party, the buyer, they're not able or willing to work with you, and that's just the way it is, and we have to accept that. It's part of doing business on eBay, and it's yet another example of how flipping ain't easy. I want you guys to have an excellent rest of your day. Take care, everyone.